History Helmet.
Hello and welcome to the History Helmet podcast, the podcast that stares history right in the eye and asks, what are you looking at? Now the terms evil, tyrant and monster are bandied around a lot these days, so I suppose when referring to today's subject, we should reach for some new, stronger language and more weighty words. It's fair to say that there is nothing you could say about this guy that goes too far. No one is going to stand up for him and say, hey, come on, that's a bit harsh calling him that, isn't it? He's been called every name under the sun, and with good cause, because he was an absolute and complete dickhead. If you haven't already guessed or read the title of this podcast, the focus of this maiden episode of the History Helmet is none other than the worst man in history, Adolf Hitler. So let's strap on the history helmet and get into it. Thinking about it now, it would have been quite fitting if we were to hear Wagner at the beginning there, particularly the Ride of the Valkyries, because Wagner was Hitler's favourite composer. It turns out Wagner was a bit of a nasty piece of work too, not really in Hitler's league, but they were both incredibly anti-Semitic. So where do we begin? What can we say about the one man literally anyone can point to and say, well, at least I'm not as bad as that guy? Well, how about this? Hitler has only got one ball. The other is in the Albert Hall. These lyrics, sung along to the Colonel Bogey marching tune, suggest that Hitler had only one testicle and therefore must be lacking in masculinity, courage and sexual prowess. But it turns out that these words were not too far from the truth. Despite Hitler's own physician, Theodor Morell, poo-pooing the claim, rumours persisted all through the war. Imagine, it is 1941 and you are Dr. Theodor Morell, doctor to the Führer. Would you tell anybody Hitler was missing a plum? He must have known that divulging any information of that sort would result in a swift meeting with a firing squad. In any case, he may not even have known about Hitler's deficit of crown jewels, because Hitler would refuse to undress for medical examinations. 50 years ago, in 1971, the USSR claimed to have evidence from an autopsy which showed that Hitler was down a ghoulie. But when was the last time you believed anything that came out of the Kremlin? What perhaps can be trusted are the medical reports from Landsberg prison, where Hitler was incarcerated in 1923. Documents relating to an examination of Hitler by Dr. Joseph Brinsteiner show that Hitler suffered from cryptorchidism, or in layman's terms, an undescended testicle. The right one. So there you have it, which is more than Hitler's doctor could say. Okay, so let's get into the part of the podcast entitled, I Didn't Know That. Without further ado, here are 5 things you may not know about Adolf Hitler. Number 1. Hitler would often stay in bed well into the afternoon. This was a habit from his days as a Bohemian art student. Hitler would stay up late and get up even later. Important decisions and communique from the war fronts would have to wait until he woke from his slumber. His housekeeper recalled him usually getting up about 2 p.m. after late-night snacking. Number 2. Hitler spent much of the last 3 years of World War II off his face on Class A drugs. Yes, his personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell, began injecting him each morning in 1938 with a cocktail of vitamins and glucose, as a kind of pick-me-up. When the attack against the USSR was launched in 1941, Dr. Morell began injecting Hitler with hormones, steroids and barbiturates. But in the summer of 1943, when things began to look increasingly bleak for the Third Reich, he moved on to harder substances, like the synthetic opioid Eucodol, which is now called oxycodone. He would also take large doses of cocaine to complement this, so in effect, he was speedballing. These drugs made Hitler delusional and made it difficult for him to see things as they really were. They also served to further isolate him from his commanders. Number 3. Hitler was almost called Adolf Schicklgruber. Hitler's father, Alois, was born out of wedlock, and as the identity of his father was unknown, he was given the surname Schicklgruber, his unmarried mother's name. However, at the age of 40, he suddenly decided to take the surname of his deceased stepfather, whom his mother had married when Alois was 5 years old, and whom he also suspected of being his actual biological father, Joseph Heidler. It is not known why the name was recorded at the government office as Hitler, but from then on, Alois called himself Hitler and was known as Hitler. Number 4. Hitler had Parkinson's disease. It was in the early 1940s that Hitler first began to exhibit traits of Parkinson's disease. His left hand would shake continuously, though he attempted to hide it by always having his hand behind his back. As the war progressed, Hitler would begin to drag his feet as though he was aging rapidly, and it was even noted that his speech was significantly affected. Number 5. Hitler was a billionaire. Estimates put Hitler's fortune at the time of his death in excess of $5 billion US. He had numerous streams of income, money collected from his rallies, forced sales from his book Mein Kampf, not to mention plundering the personal assets and art collections of those unfortunates to feel the sharp end of a Nazi bayonet. And he never paid income tax. The Inland Revenue were too afraid to ask him for it. Okay, so now let's run down the list of headlines in Hitler's life. A brief bio, birth to death. Adolf Hitler, no middle name, was born into a Roman Catholic family in Austria on April 20th, 1889. His father, Alois, was a customs official. His mother, Clara, a cousin of Alois, and 23 years his junior, a housemaid. Hitler was one of 6 children born to Alois and Clara, 4 of whom died in infancy. Alois was a distant father and husband, with little interest in family life. He was an irritable man and a severe disciplinarian, who often beat his wife, his children, and even the family dog. Clara, on the other hand, was very kind and absolutely doted on Adolf. I've seen some pictures of her, and I have to say, despite the facial resemblance to the most evil man in history, she looks all right. His father, though, looks like a bit of a bastard. In 1903, when Hitler was 14, Alois died. Hitler struggled in school and failed his high school exams, eventually leaving school at the age of 16 in 1905, after taking and passing his exams again. He had no ambition other than some vague notion of being an artist. Adrift and living a fairly aimless existence, in 1907 Hitler moved to Vienna and twice applied to the prestigious Vienna Academy of Arts, but was rejected both times. Vienna had at the time a large Jewish community, and Hitler later wrote in his book Mein Kampf that it was at this time, when he was penniless and destitute in Vienna, that the seeds of his anti-Semitism were sown. In the same year, when Hitler was just 18, his mother Clara died of breast cancer. The Hitler's family doctor, Dr. Eduard Bloch, was a Jew, who over the last 2 months of Clara's life showed great compassion and devotion to the Hitler family. Hitler later admitted that he never really recovered from the death of his mother. In 1909, with no money or prospects, Hitler haunts Vienna's homeless shelters and men's dormitories. He does part-time manual labour and actually manages to sell his paintings of Vienna's streets. In 1913, Hitler moves to the Bavarian state capital, Munich, where he identified strongly with German nationalism. Upon the outbreak of World War I in 1914, Hitler somehow managed to wangle his way into the Bavarian army, though as an Austrian he should have been refused entry. I guess they needed to make up the numbers and just looked the other way. Official reports state that Hitler distinguished himself in battle, being present at Ypres and the Somme, where he received the first of various war wounds. It was while recovering in hospital from a mustard gas attack in November 1918 that Hitler learned of Germany's surrender. He stated that he was so angry he went temporarily blind. Whoa, alarm bells. He's clearly nuts. Who goes literally blind with anger? The following year, in 1920, and still in the army, Hitler was appointed as an intelligence agent and given the assignment of infiltrating the DAP, or German Workers' Party. This he did, and to further bolster and lend credence to his cover, he began making speeches at party meetings. His skill as an orator was noticed very quickly by the chairman. Hitler became a fully fledged member of the DAP on the orders of his superiors, and soon after was introduced to one of the party's founding members, Dietrich Eckart. Eckart began grooming Hitler, becoming something of a guru to him. Hitler was discharged from the army and started working full-time for the party. Around this time, the DAP changed its name to the National Socialist German Workers' Party in an effort to increase its appeal to the man on the street. For convenience, people began referring to them as the Nazis. So, this sounds to me like the 1980s football hooligan film ID. Spoiler alert, in this film, a policeman goes undercover to try to infiltrate a gang of football soccer hooligans, only to become one of the best hooligans in the gang. Back to Hitler. It was Hitler himself who designed the new Nazi banner, a red flag with a white circle and a swastika in its centre. Hitler's ability and confidence as a speaker grew steadily. His speeches, full of vitriol for the crippling Treaty of Versailles, anti-Marxist and anti-Jewish sentiments, drew larger and larger crowds. He became party chairman in 1921. Then in late 1923, after a couple of false starts, he attempted a coup, which later became known as the Beer Hall Putsch. The coup failed and Hitler was arrested and tried for high treason. He was sentenced to 5 years in Landsberg prison, where he lived a relatively comfortable existence with his own private room and preferential treatment from the Nazi Party sympathizer guards. Hitler used his time in prison to write his book Mein Kampf, My Struggle, which he dedicated to his mentor Eckart. Eckart had died of a heart attack shortly after the attempted coup. The book laid out Hitler's plans for a reorganization of Germany along racial lines, with the Jews being in some way exterminated. In December 1924, Hitler was released from prison after serving just over a year. Mein Kampf began to sell. Between 1925 and 1932, just under 230,000 copies of the book were sold. Hitler set about spreading his message and increasing the Nazi Party's appeal. The Wall Street crash of 1929 and ensuing economic depression was a godsend for Hitler. Membership of the Nazi Party grew from just over 800,000 1 year before the crash to 6.5 million a year after, in 1930. In the general election of the same year, the Nazi Party became the second largest party in Parliament, claiming over 18% of the vote. Early in 1932, Hitler was granted German citizenship by a Nazi Party crony, who was conveniently the interior minister for the central German state of Brunswick. He had renounced his Austrian citizenship in 1925, so technically he had been stateless for 7 years. Becoming a German citizen was vital, because without it, Hitler would be unable to run for public office. The same year, 1932, Hitler ran against the incumbent Paul von Hindenburg in the presidential elections, using the slogan Hitler über Deutschland, or Hitler over Germany. The slogan had a double meaning. First, it was telling of his ultimate aim for the future of Germany, and second, because he travelled from place to place on the campaign trail in an aeroplane. Commonplace now, but back then, it was quite revolutionary. Hitler came second in the election, but had managed to amass huge support and show himself to be a formidable figure which the German establishment could not ignore. Now, if Hitler's rise to the top of the Teutonic tree had been left to his individual will, then it might never have happened. But, seeing a chance to harness some of this strange little man's popularity, two big-hitting politicians, von Papen and Hugenberg, backed up by an array of businessmen and industrialists, urged President Hindenburg to let Hitler in and give him some position of power. Against his better judgment, Hindenburg acquiesced, but had little choice as his minority government was finding a mandate from the electorate to rule Germany elusive. January 30th, 1933. Hitler is sworn in as Chancellor of the Reich. Upon his insistence, two more Nazis, Frick and Göring, were also given high positions in the cabinet. Hitler was moving his pieces into position. When the Reichstag building was burnt to the ground just 1 month later, Hitler must have thought all his Christmases had come at once. Göring was quick to declare that the fire was part of a communist plot, because a Dutch communist, Marinus van der Lubbe, was found in suspicious circumstances in the Reich building at the time of the fire. Hitler pressed Hindenburg to swiftly pass new laws to suspend basic civil rights and give the police the power to detain suspects without trial. Nazi anti-communist propaganda spread as fiercely as the Reichstag fire itself, as did the use of violence by the Nazis' paramilitary wing, the SA. In the turmoil that followed the Reichstag fire, Hitler proposed a new act which would give his government carte blanche over new laws and allow them to break from the Constitution. This eponymous Enabling Act was passed on March 23, 1933. And from that time on, Germany was a dictatorship in all but name. The summer of 1933 saw a law passed which declared the Nazi Party as the only legal party in Germany. The same summer, the infamous Night of the Long Knives, which actually went on for 3 nights, saw Hitler off all his enemies and those he perceived as a threat to his supreme leadership. They were simply rounded up and shot. Then, in August 1934, President Hindenburg died. Perhaps somewhat suspiciously, the day before, a law was passed which stated that upon Hindenburg's death, the office of president would be done away with, and the Chancellor, i.e. Hitler, would assume all the president's powers in the new role, entitled Führer. Using a combination of our mind's eye and hindsight, we now see Hitler firmly strapped into the driving seat of the 10-ton nitroglycerine juggernaut that was Germany in 1934. Travelling at ever-increasing speeds and gunning it down the centre of a 2-lane highway. Oncoming traffic swerves to avoid it. Hitler laughs, mistaking their caution for cowardice. He thinks he'll be trucking for 1,000 years, but this rig has but one destination on the not-too-distant horizon: World War II. The next 11 years of Hitler's life were a bag of mixed fortunes, inextricably and tragically bound with the fate of Germany and her people. Between 1938 and the breakout of war in 1939, Hitler's star was most certainly on the rise, and Germany was stoking up its war economy. During these years, Hitler would further consolidate power, make alliances with Russia, Italy, and Japan, and continually fan the flames of anti-Semitism and resentment in Germany for the degrading treatment the international community had doled out in the years after World War I. Land that had been lost under the Treaty of Versailles, and which was in fact home to large groups of German-speaking peoples, was recouped. The army, navy, and air force were rebuilt with furious energy. Laws were passed which virtually stripped Jews of their rights and possessions. Dr. Eduard Bloch, the Jewish doctor who had treated Hitler's mother, was granted permission to emigrate with his wife to the USA from Austria. This was a rare concession enjoyed by only a handful of Jews. From mid-1938 onwards, there could have been no doubt in the mind of any European statesman that Hitler had but one intention: war. The unification with Austria and occupation of the Czech Sudetenland in 1938 bolstered both Hitler's domestic popularity and his confidence in the belief that Germany would not be stopped in her international raids for Lebensraum, or living space. In September of 1939, Hitler's invasion of Poland kicked off the Second World War, and for the first 2 years of the conflict, he appeared to have things his own way. In 1941, Hitler made two choices that would ultimately turn the tables of war against Germany and seal her fate. First, in June of that year, he ordered the invasion of the Soviet Union. He thought he could do a quick smash-and-grab job on Russia, defeating the bear quickly and seizing her vast natural resources of oil to literally fuel the war on the Western Front. Then, in December, following the Japanese aerial attack on the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hitler declared war on the USA. In the Russian campaign, swift progress was made until the merciless winter and Hitler's refusal to allow his commanders to withdraw from the Battle of Stalingrad, which is an epic tale in its own right. This showed not just chinks in the armour of the Nazi war machine, but gaping holes. Hitler's health began steadily declining, and his behaviour grew to become more and more erratic. America's entry into the war brought with it seemingly endless supplies of troops and hardware, which tipped the balance in favour of the Allies. Still, from that time, it would be another 3.5 years before the war was to end, which is an eternity if you were an inmate of one of the many Eastern death camps set up to fulfill Hitler's long-standing desire to rid Europe of Jews. Naturally, during the 6 years of war, numerous plans were hatched to assassinate Hitler by resistance fighters and Allied commanders, but it is interesting to note that some of those very close to him also wanted him dead. Perhaps the most famous of these, not least because it was made into a movie with Tom Cruise, took place in July 1944. Operation Valkyrie was high-ranking Nazi Klaus von Stauffenberg's attempt to kill Hitler at a meeting with a bomb hidden inside a briefcase. Hitler escaped death by inches. The briefcase was actually moved away from him and behind a heavy table leg by an unwitting staff member at the last minute. Hitler was incredibly shaken by the incident, and it speaks of his paranoia and megalomania to know that almost 5,000 people were executed at his behest in an effort to root out those connected with this attempt on his life. For the last 3 months of his life, Hitler moved into his underground Führer bunker near the Reich Chancellery building. His 56th birthday, on April 20th, 1945, was the last time he dared venture to the surface. Upon this occasion, he awarded medals to some Hitler Youth boys, some as young as 14, who were now fighting against the advancing Russians on the outskirts of Berlin. April 29th was a very eventful day for Hitler. He married Eva Braun in the early hours, making his last will and testament later that afternoon. It was on the same day that Hitler learned how Mussolini had been killed and strung up by the Italian resistance. In preparation for his suicide, which he had told all around him was going to happen, Hitler tested some cyanide capsules on his dog, the German Shepherd Blondie. The dog died apparently with Hitler in floods of tears. No doubt keen to avoid a similar end to that of Mussolini, on the 30th of April, Hitler took cyanide and then shot himself in the head, with Eva Braun next to him on the sofa, who had opted for just the cyanide. Their bodies were taken outside to a garden at the rear of the Reich Chancellery, covered with gasoline, and set alight. In interviews with the forerunner to the CIA, the OSS, Dr. Eduard Bloch, the Jewish doctor to the Hitler family, stated that the thing that stood out about Hitler for him was the love he had for his mother, Clara. Bloch stated that he had never before seen such a close relationship, and that should Clara have learned what Hitler had eventually become, she would turn in her grave. Pretty heavy stuff, I'm sure you'll agree. So, in summing up, how do you sum up a guy like Hitler? History is completely without his equal. He is the man who everyone holds responsible for World War II, the Holocaust, tens of millions of deaths. He is the epitome of hatred and evil, and the most extreme example of a human being one can recall. He was the man who hypnotized the nation into oblivion. Here's what others have said about Hitler. Churchill said of him, "Hitler is a monster of wickedness, insatiable in his lust for blood and plunder." The historian Sir Ian Kershaw said, "What Hitler did was advertised unoriginal ideas in an original way. He gave voice to phobias, prejudice, and resentment as no one else could." Others could say the same thing, but make no impact at all. President Roosevelt said, "Hitler built a fortress around Europe, but he forgot to put a roof on it." The historian William L. Shirer said, "Adolf Hitler is probably the last of the great adventure conquerors in the tradition of Alexander, Caesar, and Napoleon." Birthdays. Hitler shares a birthday with singer Luther Vandross, actor Crispin Glover, and tennis ace Alexander Zverev. Okay. There is always that question about what if Hitler had never existed? Would things have been different? Could someone else have taken his place? Alan Bullock, in his book Hitler, A Study in Tyranny, said of Hitler, "No other man played a role in the Nazi revolution or in the history of the Third Reich remotely comparable with that of Hitler." Was he the worst man in history? Well, he's certainly the worst man in history to be defeated, and the full extent of his crimes to see the light of day. There have been others, there are some even alive today, who have committed genocide and waged war, but died and will die of old age in warm beds in plush palaces. Hitler was so obviously the bad guy in the story of World War II. All blame has been neatly laid at his door, and with his death, it has been claimed that the spell over the German people was broken. But was it? Could one man take the blame for bringing an entire nation to the brink of oblivion? I find that hard to believe. The minds of those who listened to his rhetoric had to be open to such ideas, fertile soil in which those twisted seeds could take root and grow. Perhaps those thousands we see at the huge rallies waving flags and smiling never imagined what the end result of the promise of Lebensraum or the question of what to do with Europe's Jews would be. The millions of dead, the horrors experienced by soldiers and civilians alike, the industrial scale of genocide, all this was unthinkable until it happened. Hitler dreamed it, but who made the dream come true? In the words of John Stuart Mill, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. Well, how about an entire nation of good men doing nothing? An entire nation who were told that they were the descendants of gods, rightful rulers of the world, allowed to get away with their bullying and drunk on their own expansionist success. In that environment, evil not only triumphed, it flourished. Watching the archive footage of his speeches, what is clear is that Hitler was an angry and hate-filled man. A psychiatrist would say that his bullying father and mollycoddling mother cannot be discounted when attempting to explain him. Like is the case with so many of us, the child is the father of the man. Hitler believed he was special, destined for greatness, and that it was only a matter of time before everyone else realized this. When he achieved the highest office in the land, it was a surprise to everyone in Germany, except him. He was the hero of his own Wagnerian opera. Could even his medals for bravery when serving as a soldier in World War I be accounted to an unwavering belief that no bullet or shell could touch him because he was bound for glory? We will never be able to say for sure. What we can say is that he was a chancer who was invited into power by men eager to share in his popularity. He was tolerated and appeased, and he went all the way. Having said that, we cannot ignore the contribution that Hitler's own personality, political maneuvering, and drive made to his rise to power. But these things were bolstered by important people like von Hindenburg opening the doors and the blind luck of the Reichstag fire. For me, two things above all tell of his mindset: his attack on the USSR and declaration of war on the USA in the same year, whilst already fighting against the British. These actions scream delusion. Did he honestly think he could beat the combined might of the three most powerful nations in the world? I think he did. Let's finish with a quote that I think gives us an interesting insight into his way of thinking, from the man himself. Hitler said, "Think 1,000 times before taking a decision. But after taking a decision, never turn back, even if you get 1,000 difficulties." So, Hitler, in conclusion, bit of an arrogant bastard, bad guy, bad ideas. That's it for this week. See you next time.